Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you the emotional journey of David Walker, a man who finds himself caught between the past and the future. Love and betrayal. After the tragic loss of his wife, David tries to rebuild his life with his young daughter, Lily. But when he opens his heart to someone new, he never imagines the shocking betrayal that awaits. Join us as we dive into a story filled with heartbreak, unexpected twists, and profound lessons about trust, resilience, and the power of moving forward. Please subscribe to our channel to begin the story today. David Walker stood outside his office building, staring at the winter landscape before him. The cold bit at his face as he stepped onto the snow-covered pavement. But it was the emptiness inside him that stung the most. It had been 4 years since Emily, his wife, had died during childbirth. He could still see her smile in his mind, still hear her laughter echoing through their home. But those moments had been erased by grief and guilt. His daughter, Lily, was now all that remained of the love they had shared. But even her radiant presence couldn't entirely fill the void left by Emily's absence. As David walked to his car, the weight of his thoughts became unbearable. He had tried to be a good father to Lily. He did everything he could to give her the stability and love she deserved. But every day, it seemed like a struggle, like trying to swim against a tide that kept pushing him back. The memories of Emily haunted him. They had been so young, so full of promise. They had planned a life full of adventures, dreams, and family. But in an instant, it was all gone. His breath formed a thick cloud of mist in the chilly air. And with it, the quiet ache of loss followed him to the car. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his reverie. It was Miss Rich, Lily's nanny. "Good evening, Mr. Walker," Miss Rich's calm voice said when he picked up. "Good evening, Miss Rich. How's my little girl?" David asked, a smile tugging at his lips despite the weight in his chest. Joyful laughter and excited shouts echoed through the phone. "I'm building a castle, Daddy, a big one." Lily's voice rang through, like magic, lifting his spirits just a little. David could feel the warmth of her joy spread across his heart. The darkness inside momentarily pushed aside. "I'll be home soon, Princess," he replied softly, ending the call. That night, as he drove home, something in David shifted. It wasn't just the exhaustion from the day, nor was it simply the coldness of the evening. It was something deeper, something more intangible. Perhaps it was the moment when he realized that Lily, now growing up so fast, needed more than just his presence. She needed happiness, a sense of completeness, a future that wasn't always shadowed by the past. At a small flower shop on the way, David stopped uncharacteristically to pick up a bouquet of crimson roses. Each one seemed to hold the memory of Emily, each petal a reminder that her love would never fade. David wasn't sure if these gestures meant anything anymore, if they made a difference in his journey of healing. But in that moment, he needed to do something. The roses were for Emily, but they were also for himself, for Lily, for the family he wanted to rebuild. When David arrived at the cemetery, the wind howled through the gray sky, as though it too mourned the loss of his wife. His heart raced as he walked to Emily's grave, the same feeling of guilt tugging at his chest, threatening to pull him under. He knelt beside the gravestone, his eyes filled with tears. "I miss you so much, my love," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't help but feel I failed you. Failed us. Lily needs her mother." His words were barely audible. Lost in the wind, he stood there, time stretching, empty, not finding the solace he so desperately sought. David placed the bouquet gently on the grave, his fingers brushing the cold stone. In that silence, in that vast emptiness, he longed for something more than memories. He longed for a future that wasn't overshadowed by loss. The drive home was quiet, almost as though the universe had conspired to match his mood. But the moment he opened the door, Lily's laughter filled the space like a burst of sunlight through clouds. "Daddy's home," she cried, throwing herself into his arms. David lifted her up, spinning her around the way he used to do with Emily. It was a fleeting moment of pure joy, one he tried to savor. His eyes glistened, torn between happiness for his daughter and the ache of longing for the life that had been. "How's my princess?" he asked, smiling as he set her down. "We built a castle out of blocks. It's so big, you'll have to come see." Lily grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the playroom. David followed, watching her, the way she was growing so fast. In that playroom, where the walls were adorned with colorful drawings, he knelt down to admire the castle. Lily's face lit up with pride, her eyes sparkling with the innocence of a child whose world was filled with possibilities. In that moment, David allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. That evening, as they shared dinner, baked chicken and salad, prepared by Miss Rich, David read Lily a bedtime story. She fell asleep quickly, her tiny form curled up beside him. David ran his fingers through her hair and whispered softly, "Mommy loves you, sweetie." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and a wave of grief hit him like a tide. He wanted so desperately for Lily to have the mother she deserved. As the night wore on, David lay in bed, his thoughts wandering. The love he had for Emily was so strong, so palpable, yet it was now intertwined with pain, regret, and the haunting question of whether he could ever truly move on. He had always been her rock, and she had been his. How could he ever let go of someone who had been such an integral part of his life? How could he embrace the future without her? Sleep didn't come easily that night. His mind was restless, like the storm raging outside. But in the stillness of the early morning, when he finally awoke, there was a sense of resolution stirring within him. Perhaps it was time to start letting go of the past, not in the sense of forgetting, but in allowing room for new possibilities, new hopes. The day began as usual, with the warmth of coffee in the kitchen and the quiet companionship of his daughter. As Lily slept, David sipped his coffee, his thoughts drifting between the day's work and the changes that were quietly unfolding. He was starting to see that there might be room in his life for more than just the memories of Emily. Perhaps there was space for someone else, someone who could bring warmth and joy to their home again. But David had no idea just how much life, love, and heartache were waiting for him in the days ahead. The next morning, the office was alive with the usual hum of activity. David stepped into the bustling environment of his company, the weight of the day's tasks already pressing on him. He was accustomed to the routine, papers to sign, meetings to attend, decisions to make, but today, his mind was clouded, distracted by the thoughts of Olivia and the strange pull he felt toward her. She had been a fixture in his business dealings, a quiet but confident presence that he couldn't help but notice more and more. He sat down at his desk, his fingers briefly grazing the surface before diving into the stack of proposals that awaited his attention. The documents, though important, seemed irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. His mind kept drifting back to their last conversation. The way Olivia had smiled. Her kindness laced with something more, something he hadn't yet identified. He couldn't quite place it, but something told him that she wasn't just a colleague. As he flipped through the pages, his secretary, Rachel, entered the room with a file in her hands. "Good morning, Mr. Walker. You have a meeting scheduled with Mr. Thompson and his team at noon today," she said, handing him the folder with all the details for the upcoming meeting. David nodded, though his thoughts were still elsewhere. "Thank you, Rachel. I'll be ready." He glanced down at the document, trying to focus, but instead of the numbers and figures, his mind wandered to Olivia again. The night they had spent talking had been nothing short of pleasant, and he couldn't shake the thought of how easily they had connected. Her warm presence had eased the tension in his life, even if just for a short while. The clock struck noon, and David knew it was time to head to the law firm. As he entered the building, he was greeted by the sharp professionalism of Mr. Thompson, who, along with his assistant, Olivia, was already seated at the conference table. The familiar atmosphere of the meeting space should have reassured him, but instead, a sense of unease settled in his chest. "Mr. Walker, we're ready to begin. We've reviewed your proposal," Mr. Thompson said, extending a hand. "I must say, we're quite impressed with what you've prepared." David shook his hand, his nerves momentarily calming. "Thank you. I hope we can come to a mutually beneficial agreement. He replied, his voice steady, but behind his words, there was an underlying tension he couldn't ignore. As they delved into the details of the agreement, David listened intently. The proposal was straightforward, but Mr. Thompson's team had their sights set on a larger percentage, something David knew would increase the risks for both sides. Every point they discussed, every new figure thrown into the conversation, only made David more uneasy. He wanted to make sure the deal worked for everyone, but there were moments when he felt like he was being pushed into a corner. As the meeting continued, Olivia remained quiet for most of the discussion, her eyes scanning the papers. Every now and then, she'd offer a quiet nod or a small suggestion, but it was clear she was observing more than participating. David couldn't help but notice the way she looked at him. Her gaze not just professional but soft, almost caring. His thoughts became clouded again, this time more conflicted than before. Was it just the business or was there something more between them? Finally, after what seemed like hours, the meeting wound down. Mr. Thompson raised a final point that David hadn't anticipated. David, I think we should discuss the possibility of increasing the percentages. We believe this would help secure a long-term partnership. David felt the weight of his decision pressing on him. He knew that agreeing to this could jeopardize the balance he had worked so hard to maintain. But he didn't want to lose this partnership either. He turned to Olivia, hoping for guidance. She met his eyes briefly, offering a reassuring look, but she remained silent. It was clear that the decision was his to make. Perhaps a compromise is in order, David said, trying to buy himself some time. We could offer a bonus or other incentives to offset the increase. But I think it's important that we all feel secure in this deal. Olivia nodded, a subtle approval in her expression. David felt a small sense of relief wash over him. Maybe he wasn't entirely alone in this. As the meeting concluded and everyone stood to leave, Olivia caught up with David at the door. I think you handled that well, she said quietly, her words sincere. You've got a good head for business. David smiled, though the compliment did little to ease the growing sense of confusion within him. Thank you, Olivia, that means a lot coming from you. As he left the law firm, David couldn't help but feel that the day had been a turning point. In his professional life, he had navigated the storm of negotiation and come out relatively unscathed. But his personal life seemed more complicated than ever. Olivia had offered him the kind of warmth and understanding that he hadn't realized he needed. But was it just business? Or was there something deeper? For the first time in years, David wasn't just going home to his daughter. He was going home to a life that was beginning to feel uncertain, full of possibilities, but also fraught with the fear of what might come next. The days following the meeting were filled with the usual chaos of work, emails to reply to, proposals to review, phone calls to make, but in the midst of it all, David found his thoughts drifting back to Olivia. Something about her lingered in his mind, a softness in her demeanor that struck him in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't just another assistant in the office. There was a quiet strength in her, a presence that seemed to ease the tension in his life. A life that had been overshadowed by grief and responsibility for so long. As the week passed, David began to notice little moments that seemed to speak volumes. Olivia's kindness, her willingness to listen, and her subtle ways of offering support without being intrusive. It wasn't anything overt, but David couldn't ignore the way he felt when she was around. At times, it was almost like the weight on his shoulders would lighten, if only for a brief moment. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, David found himself standing outside the office building, the evening sky painting itself in shades of purple and orange. He was about to get into his car when he heard a familiar voice calling his name. Turning around, he saw Olivia walking toward him with a gentle smile on her face. "Hey, David, I was hoping to catch you before you left," she said, her voice soft but confident. David smiled, his heart skipping a beat at the sound of her voice. "Olivia, what's on your mind?" She paused, hesitating for a moment. "I wanted to thank you for how you handled the meeting the other day. You were calm, decisive. It's impressive. Not everyone can do that." David shrugged, trying to play it off, though he could feel a flush of warmth spread across his face. It wasn't just me. We all worked together, after all. But you made the final call. And it was the right one. She insisted, her gaze meeting his with an earnestness that made his chest tighten. There was a long silence between them. A moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. David could feel the air between them shift. Something unspoken but understood. It was then that Olivia took a small step closer. Her eyes searching his face as though trying to read his thoughts. Would you like to grab a drink sometime? Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe after work? Just to relax. No business talk. Just us. David felt a wave of surprise wash over him. He had been caught off guard, unsure of how to respond. For so long, he had been consumed by the memory of Emily, so focused on his daughter Lily and the heaviness of responsibility. But in that moment, he felt a flicker of something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Sure, he replied, his voice steady but his heart racing. I think that sounds like a good idea. As they walked to the nearby bar that evening, David couldn't help but notice how natural it felt to be with Olivia. How the conversation flowed so easily between them. There was no pressure, no expectations. Just two people sharing a moment of connection. Olivia spoke of her work, her dreams, her favorite books and hobbies, while David listened intently, occasionally offering his own thoughts. The evening felt like an escape, a brief respite from the weight of his life. When the night drew to a close, David found himself reluctant to say goodbye. It was rare that he felt such ease with someone, and yet here he was, enjoying the simplicity of a conversation with Olivia. He knew that he wasn't ready to jump into anything, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope, a spark of possibility. As they said their goodbyes, Olivia turned to him with a smile. I'll see you tomorrow, David. Yes, he replied, smiling back, though the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Tomorrow. But as he drove home that evening, his thoughts lingered on her words, on the way her presence had filled a space inside him that he hadn't even known was empty. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he was open to the idea of it, the possibility of moving forward, of building something new. When David returned home, Lily was already asleep, her soft breathing filling the silence of the house. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, watching her sleep, her face peaceful and content. His heart swelled with love for her. And yet, a part of him knew that he couldn't continue living in the shadow of the past forever. Lily needed more than a grieving father. She needed someone who could give her the joy and love she deserved. Just as David needed someone to help him rebuild the life he had lost. As he sat down on the couch that night, David's thoughts were a tangle of emotions, guilt, hope, fear, and longing. But amidst it all, there was a quiet resolve. It was time to start moving forward. Even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The future, with all its uncertainties, was something David was finally willing to face. David woke up the next morning with a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. The previous evening had left him with a sense of warmth that had carried him through the night. Yet there was something tugging at him, a feeling of uncertainty about the path he was walking down with Olivia. He had enjoyed their evening together, but now, as the morning light filtered through the blinds, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He tried to shake off the thought as he went through his morning routine. Lily was already awake, bouncing around with energy as usual. Her smile brightened his day, grounding him in the present, in the small joys of fatherhood. Yet, as he prepared breakfast and got Lily ready for her day, he couldn't help but think back to the conversation he'd had with Olivia. It had felt easy and natural, but part of him kept asking, was this the right time? Was he rushing into something without truly understanding what it meant for him or Lily? His phone buzzed as he was heading out the door, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from Olivia. Good morning, David. I hope you have a great day ahead. I'll be thinking of you. His heart fluttered at the message, but he pushed the feeling aside. There were bigger things to focus on today. His meeting with Mr. Thompson. the ongoing negotiations with his business partners, and the reality of his responsibilities as both a father and a professional. But that afternoon, everything changed. David had just returned home from a long day at the office when he walked into the kitchen and saw Lily sitting at the table. Her eyes wide with fear. She was holding something in her hands, tightly clenched, like a secret she wasn't sure how to reveal. As soon as David stepped inside, she stood up quickly, a look of anxiety on her face. "Daddy, don't drink the tea from that cup," Lily said, her voice trembling. "The new mom put poison in it." David froze. His mind raced, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Poison? He looked down at the cup in his hand, then back at Lily, who was staring at him with a mixture of concern and fear. Her words, though jumbled and impossible to comprehend in the moment, struck him with a sense of cold dread. For a moment, he simply stood there, disbelief written across his face. His mind refused to make sense of what Lily had just said. Poison? Why would Olivia, of all people, do something like this? Trying to remain calm, David put the cup down slowly, his hands shaking. "What are you talking about, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice soft but trembling. "Where did you hear that?" Lily's small voice barely broke the silence. "I heard her talking on the phone. She said she was going to put poison in your tea. She said that you'd be disabled forever and that then they could take over your company." David's heart sank. Every word Lily spoke cut through him like a sharp knife. He could barely process it, his mind racing to piece together what she had overheard. He remembered the conversations he'd had with Olivia. How easy it had been to trust her. How her presence had started to feel like a balm for his wounded heart. But now, everything felt like a lie. A facade built on a foundation of deceit. "Are you sure, Lily?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. He needed to be sure. But deep down, he knew there was no mistaking the sincerity in her eyes. No ignoring the fear that gripped her little heart. Lily nodded, her face pale. "I'm sure, Daddy. I didn't want anything to happen to you." The realization hit David with full force. A wave of disbelief and anger rushing through him. Olivia, someone he had begun to trust, had plotted something unthinkable. He had welcomed her into his life, into their home, and now, this. The very idea that she would hurt him, let alone put Lily in danger, made his stomach churn. His first instinct was to confront Olivia immediately, but then he stopped himself. If what Lily said was true, he needed to be smart. He had to think, to plan. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. David switched the cups, taking a calculated risk. When Olivia returned to the kitchen, she didn't seem to notice anything different. She smiled as she poured the tea. Her movements calm, her words light. "I can't wait to drink this," she said, her tone casual. "I've had such a long day. This will help me relax." David watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. He said nothing, only observed her, trying to steady himself. Olivia took the first sip of her tea, and for a moment, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, it happened. Her face flushed, her hand shaking, and she gasped for air. "I don't feel," Olivia choked, her eyes wide with panic. She collapsed to the floor, struggling to breathe, her body convulsing in shock. David quickly dialed for an ambulance, his thoughts a chaotic mess as he knelt by Olivia's side. The woman he had let into his life, the woman he had started to care for, was now lying on the floor, gasping for air. But beneath the panic, something else burned inside him: betrayal, confusion, a deep sense of grief. How had he been so blind? When the paramedics arrived and rushed Olivia to the hospital, David was left standing in the silence of the kitchen, the weight of the night pressing on him. What was happening to his life? His thoughts kept returning to Lily's innocent warning, her desperate plea to protect him. He had to get to the bottom of this. As he sat in the waiting room at the hospital, his heart raced, his mind still reeling from the events that had unfolded. And then, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "David, I think you need to know something." It was Jake, his best friend, standing at the entrance, his face pale and filled with regret. Jake? David asked, his voice cold with disbelief. What are you doing here? Jake swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. I'm sorry, David, I didn't want you to find out like this. But Olivia wasn't doing this alone. She was working with me. He paused, his voice trembling. She's pregnant with my child. The words hit David like a blow to the chest. Olivia, his trusted confidant, had been playing him from the start. And Jake, his best friend, had betrayed him in the most painful way possible. He had wanted revenge. He had wanted to hurt David the way David had unknowingly hurt him by being with Emily. David's world, already shattered by grief, was now crumbling under the weight of the ultimate betrayal. What remained of his trust, his sense of security, had been destroyed in an instant. He had been played, manipulated, and lied to by those he had opened his heart to. As Jake continued to explain, David could barely keep up with the words. All he could hear was the quiet storm inside his chest. His life forever changed by the treachery of those closest to him. He had to rebuild, but how could he when everything he thought he knew had been shattered? David sat in the cold, sterile hospital room, his thoughts swirling. Olivia lay unconscious in the bed, the life she had nearly stolen from him now hanging in the balance. His mind couldn't escape the betrayal, the shock of learning that his best friend, Jake, had been behind the scheme all along. His world had fractured, and the foundation of trust he had built over the years had crumbled. As he looked out the window, the sky was tinged with the soft glow of dawn, a reminder that life, no matter how broken, would continue. His daughter, Lily, had been his anchor through it all. And now, more than ever, he knew that he had to protect her from the storm that raged within him. She needed him to be strong. The road ahead was uncertain. The relationships he had once cherished were now tainted with deceit. And the wounds would take time to heal. But in that moment, as he thought about his daughter, he realized that he had the power to rebuild. It would take patience, forgiveness, and perhaps a new understanding of the strength that lay within him. But he wasn't going to let the darkness of betrayal define his future. With a deep breath, David stood up, determined to face whatever came next. He had been through pain, and now he was ready to reclaim his life. He had learned the hard way that love and trust were precious. And he was prepared to protect both fiercely. Starting with his daughter, the journey to healing would be long. But David knew one thing for sure, he wasn't alone anymore. Thank you for watching this life story. Please subscribe to our channel to follow more stories like this.